A transatlantic long-haul flight carrying 401 passengers faces a catastrophic failure of electronic systems over the Atlantic Ocean. With all navigation instruments simultaneously shut down, the captain must rely solely on his experience and instinct to keep the aircraft level over turbulent waters. With less than a minute of fuel available for maneuvers and the pitch-black night hiding the horizon, every second counts in this desperate race for the survival of hundreds of lives. 60 seconds. That's how long it took for my entire life in aviation to come down to a single moment of pure instinct over the most unforgiving ocean on the planet. 60 seconds where every instrument, every light, every system I knew simply went dark, leaving only the roar of the engines and 401 souls depending on decisions I'd have to make in absolute darkness. It was an ordinary Tuesday in November when I took the controls of that Boeing 777-300ER for a transatlantic flight. 17 years in the profession, over 12,000 flight hours, international certifications, training in the world's most advanced simulators. I thought I'd seen everything, that I was prepared for any emergency, but nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what would happen that night over the Atlantic. The pre-flight checklist went through without any abnormalities. The aircraft was impeccable, fresh from scheduled maintenance. My co-pilot, Michael, was an experienced professional I'd flown with dozens of times. We had perfect cockpit rapport. The cabin crew was exceptional, led by Chief Flight Attendant Sarah, a veteran with 23 years in the profession. Everything indicated an absolutely routine flight from New York to London, crossing the ocean during the early morning hours, while most passengers would sleep peacefully in their seats. We took off on time at 11:47 p.m., with clear skies and favorable weather conditions throughout the route. The climb was smooth, and soon we were leveled at our cruise altitude, 41,000 feet, flying at Mach 0.4 over the Atlantic. The lights of the American coast disappeared behind us, swallowed by the black immensity of the ocean. Ahead, only water for more than 4 hours until we'd spot the European coast. It was the part of the flight I loved most, that majestic solitude, the feeling of being suspended between sky and sea, commanding an extraordinary machine through the night. I was halfway through my meal when everything changed. It was 2:34 in the morning when I heard a different electronic snap, as if something had disconnected abruptly. It wasn't loud but unmistakable to trained ears. I lifted my eyes to the panel and felt my stomach freeze. One by one, the instrument panel screens began to flicker. First, the primary navigation display, then the flight management system, next, the attitude instruments. It wasn't a gradual failure. It was a cascading systemic collapse happening before my eyes. Michael immediately dropped his coffee cup, and I saw the same terror reflected in his face that was surely stamped on mine. "What's happening?" he whispered, his hands already flying over the controls, trying to restore the systems. But it was no use. In less than 20 seconds, all the main monitors went completely black. The cockpit, normally illuminated by dozens of modern LCD screens, plunged into sinister dimness, lit only by the red-orange emergency lights. It was as if someone had ripped out the aircraft's eyes. We were flying completely blind over the ocean at 900 kilometers per hour, carrying 401 people who slept peacefully, having no idea of the hell that had just begun. My first reaction was to try to stay calm and assess what still worked. The engines continued operating normally, that was good. I could feel the aircraft responding to commands when I moved the yoke gently. The hydraulic system seemed intact, but without instruments, I had no way of knowing our exact altitude, our speed, our attitude relative to the horizon, our GPS position, nothing. We were an island of aluminum and titanium floating blind through absolute darkness. And worst of all, it was pitch black night. No moon, no visible stars due to a layer of high clouds. Looking out the window, I couldn't distinguish where the ocean ended and the sky began. Everything was just an infinite black void. "Captain, we've lost all primary and secondary systems," Michael reported, his voice tense but controlled, the result of rigorous training. Attempting manual boot of backup computers. While he worked frantically on emergency procedures, I immediately activated the backup communication control. "Atlantic Control, we have an emergency. Total electronic systems failure. Requesting vectors and altitude immediately." Silence. I tried again. More silence. The radio was dead too. We were completely isolated, without instruments and without communication, over one of the most remote points on the planet. I closed my eyes for 3 seconds. It's a technique I learned many years ago. When chaos takes over, close your eyes briefly. Take a deep breath and organize priorities. Priority 1, keep the aircraft level and stable. Priority 2, determine our actual situation. Priority 3, make decisions about the next step. Sounds simple, but when you're sitting in a command seat with 401 lives on your shoulders and no instruments working, believe me, your mind wants to panic. I knew we had only a few seconds before the situation would deteriorate completely. Without external visual references and without instruments, a pilot can easily lose perception of the aircraft's attitude. This is called spatial disorientation, and it's one of the deadliest causes of accidents in aviation. Your body simply can't feel whether you're climbing, descending, turning, or level when you have no external references. I've seen experienced pilots in simulators enter a death spiral in less than 2 minutes when deprived of visual instruments, and we had hundreds of people depending on my ability not to make that mistake. That's when I had a perception that would save us all. Through years of flying, I'd developed acute sensitivity to aircraft sounds. Every plane has its own sound signature, its own song. The tone of wind passing over the fuselage, the frequency of engine vibration, even the subtle creaking of the structure under aerodynamic load. I closed my eyes again and concentrated only on sound. The engines were at a constant uniform tone. Good sign. The whistle of wind through the window seals was stable. Also good. There wasn't that growing moan that would indicate a dive, nor the sharp whistle that would betray a steep climb. I placed my left hand gently on the yoke, without squeezing, just feeling. It's something few modern pilots still do. In the age of fly-by-wire and complete automation, we've lost a bit of that tactile connection with the machine. But I learned to fly in old aircraft, where you felt every gust of wind, every attitude change through the controls. And now that old skill was all I had left. I felt a slight pressure to the right. The aircraft was beginning to bank imperceptibly. I compensated with a minimal touch of left aileron. The pressure equalized. We were level again. "Michael, backup status?" I asked, maintaining my absolute concentration on sounds and sensations. "Nothing, Captain. The computers aren't restarting. It's like the primary power source for the avionics systems has been completely cut off." His voice had a tone of disbelief. "This simply shouldn't be possible. The 777 has redundancies upon redundancies. 3 independent hydraulic systems, multiple electrical power sources, backup generators, emergency batteries. For everything to fail simultaneously, it was statistically impossible, but it was happening. I looked outside again. Nothing. Just the absolute black void. And it was at that moment that Sarah opened the cockpit door. She immediately sensed the situation from the red dimness and our tense faces. "Captain?" she asked, her voice firm but her eyes revealing concern. "Sarah, we have a total systems failure, but the aircraft is controllable. Keep the cabin absolutely calm. Nobody can know we have a problem. Continue normal service, keep the lights low so as not to wake the passengers." "Understood?" She nodded, professional as always, and closed the door softly. I knew I could trust her to keep the crew focused. 45 seconds had passed since the initial failure. Each second felt like an eternity. Michael continued trying every possible procedure to restore at least some basic instruments. I kept the flight stable using only my sensations and years of experience. But a new concern arose. Fuel. Before the failure, I'd briefly seen our numbers. We had enough fuel to reach London with regulatory reserves, but now, without the flight management computer, I didn't know our exact consumption rate, our ground speed, which could be affected by winds I couldn't measure, or even our precise altitude, which directly affects consumption efficiency. The voice of reason in my head was screaming, "Descend. Descend to an altitude where you can see the ocean, have a visual reference." But the voice of experience whispered louder, "At what cost? Spend precious fuel on a blind descent? What if you destabilize the aircraft in the process? What if you create panic in the cabin when passengers feel the abrupt descent?" I had to trust my training, my ability to maintain level flight until we could restore something, anything. That's when I felt something change in the aircraft. An almost imperceptible vibration, but different. My hand on the yoke detected slightly increased resistance. I looked at Michael, who had felt it too. "We're encountering turbulence," I said, and turbulence at that moment was simultaneously my greatest threat and my potential salvation. A threat because it could destabilize the aircraft at a time when we were flying blind. Salvation because it meant there were convective clouds nearby, and clouds mean atmospheric activity I could perhaps use as a reference. If I could see lightning in the distance, I'd have at least some notion of where the horizon was. 60 full seconds since the failure. And then, like a gift from the aviation gods, I saw something through the windshield. A distant flash. Then another. Lightning from a storm at least 80 kilometers ahead of us. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For a fraction of a second, when the lightning illuminated the clouds, I could see a faint line where the sky met the cloud layer below. A horizon. Even if temporary, even if imperfect, it was a visual reference. I focused my vision on that area, waiting for the next flash. 3 seconds, 5, 8, another lightning bolt. There it was, the artificial horizon created by nature. And by the momentary illumination, I confirmed. We were level. My instinct, my senses had kept me at the correct attitude. "Michael, can you see the lightning?" "Affirmative, Captain. Storm ahead, probably about 150 kilometers. "We need them. They're our only reference now. I'm going to navigate keeping that storm cell ahead of us, using the flashes as an artificial horizon." It was a technique I'd never practiced. That doesn't exist in any manual, but that made perfect sense in that moment of controlled desperation. It was using nature itself as my flight instrument, but I also knew we couldn't continue like this indefinitely. Without communication with air traffic control, other aircraft didn't know about our situation. We were technically invisible to the system, flying on one of the busiest Atlantic routes. We needed to descend to a safer altitude. We needed to restore some system. We needed to make decisions about our destination. Continue to London? Try to return to the US? Divert to some Atlantic island? Each option had its risks, and without precise instruments, all seemed equally risky bets. Then I felt another change, a soft metallic click coming from somewhere behind the panel, and suddenly a single screen began to flicker, slowly coming back to life. It was the backup display of the attitude system. We didn't have navigation, we didn't have communication, we didn't have flight management. But we had, miraculously, our emergency electronic artificial horizon. It was powered by a completely independent battery, and apparently, after a minute of reset, it had reinitialized on its own. That small screen showed me exactly what my senses had already told me. We were perfectly level, at an altitude the system estimated at 40,000 to 800 feet. I saw tears forming in the corners of Michael's eyes. It wasn't much, but it was everything. With that single instrument, we had a chance. I breathed deeply, feeling the tension in my shoulders begin to ease slightly. I looked at the clock on the panel, which worked with its own internal battery. 67 seconds had passed since the failure began. 67 seconds that felt like a lifetime. 67 seconds where the line between a normal flight and an oceanic tragedy had been as thin as the aircraft's wing. Now comes the part where many think the story ends. That we restored the systems, everything returned to normal, and we landed happily in London. But the truth is, that was just the beginning of a 4-hour odyssey that would test every ounce of knowledge, every moment of training, every instinct I'd developed in nearly 2 decades of aviation. Because flying with just one attitude instrument, without navigation, without communication, without fuel management, over thousands of kilometers of dark ocean, carrying 401 souls who trusted me, would be the ultimate challenge of my career. I called Sarah back to the cockpit. "I need you to do something unusual. Go to the cabin discreetly and identify if we have any pilots among the passengers. Any pilot from any airline, any type of aircraft. Don't cause alarm. Just check the manifests and, if you find someone, ask them to come to the cockpit." She left immediately. Meanwhile, Michael and I began working on a plan. With just the attitude instrument, we could maintain level flight. The storm ahead gave us a rough directional reference, but we needed to know where we were and where we were going. "Michael, before the failure, what was our last known position?" "Approximately 40 degrees north, 35 degrees west, Captain." He'd memorized it. Good man. And our heading. 060, practically northeast. Estimated speed? If we maintain current power and assuming historical average winds for this route and season, I'd say we're doing about 850 kilometers per hour over the ground. It wasn't precise, but it was a start. I knew this route like the back of my hand. I'd flown this crossing over 200 times. I closed my eyes and visualized the Atlantic map. From our last known position, flying northeast, the next large landmass would be the Azores, about 2,500 kilometers away, approximately 3 hours of flight in our current conditions. But 3 hours is an eternity when you're flying manually, without autopilot, with minimal instrumentation, maintaining absolute concentration every second to not lose the aircraft's attitude. And that's not even mentioning fuel. Before the failure, we had reserves to reach London, but London was now out of the question. Even if we aimed for the Azores, we'd be rolling dice with our fuel reserves because without the management computer, we had no way to know exactly how much we were consuming or how much we had left precisely. Sarah returned with mixed news. "Captain, we have a private pilot in seat 23J, but he only flies small single-engine aircraft. And we have a retired aerospace engineer in business class, seat 7A. He worked for years on the 777 project." I asked her to bring the engineer. Moments later, a man of about 70 years, grey hair and alert eyes, entered the cockpit. I quickly explained the situation. He listened in silence, then nodded. "Captain, I worked on this aircraft's electrical and avionics systems during its development. What you're describing sounds like a catastrophic failure in the main avionics power bus, probably a severe short circuit that activated all the circuit breakers simultaneously. Is there any way to manually reset?" I asked. He thought for a moment. "Theoretically, yes, but we'd have to access the electronic compartment below the cockpit, identify the correct circuit breakers among hundreds of them, and attempt a manual reset. The risk is that if there's a real short, by reconnecting them, we could cause an electrical fire." It was an impossible dilemma. Try to restore systems with fire risk or continue flying blind. I made the hardest decision of my life. We're not going to risk it. We'll continue like this. Michael, calculate our best emergency landing option, considering our estimated position and presumed fuel. While he worked on mental calculations and paper maps we found in the cockpit's emergency compartments, I kept the aircraft stable. The engineer, whose name I learned was Henry, remained with us, offering valuable technical insights. He explained that the attitude instrument that had returned worked because it had its own completely isolated power source, designed exactly for this type of improbable emergency. "But Captain," he warned, "that battery has autonomy of only about 6 hours. After that, you'll really be flying blind." 6 hours. We had at most 6 hours to land this aircraft somewhere. Michael completed his calculations. "Captain, based on our estimates, our best option is Lajes Field in the Azores. It's a joint military-civilian airport, long runway, and should be approximately 3 hours and 15 minutes ahead of us, slightly north of our current heading. If we adjust our course by about 15 degrees left, we should intercept the island. The Azores, a small Portuguese archipelago in the middle of the Atlantic. It wasn't my first choice, but given the circumstances, it made perfect sense." "Agreed. Prepare for course adjustment." But how to adjust course without compass, without GPS, without any navigation instruments? Only with our visual reference of the storms and our instinct. I decided to use an old technique I learned when I started flying, basic celestial navigation. Even with the clouds, I could occasionally see some stars through openings. I identified the constellation Orion, which at that time of year and latitude was relatively high in the sky. Using Orion's position and my memory of celestial navigation, I calculated approximately where true north should be. With that, I made a gentle turn of 15 degrees left, using only my attitude instrument and the stars as reference. It was navigation like the aviation pioneers did in the 1920s and 1930s. And there I was in 2024, piloting one of the world's most advanced aircraft, using century-old techniques. The next 2 hours were a test of mental and physical endurance. Flying manually, maintaining absolute concentration, unable to rely on autopilot, is extremely exhausting. Michael and I took turns on the controls every 20 minutes, allowing one to rest briefly, while the other maintained vigilance. Henry remained with us, monitoring any sign of main systems returning. Sarah kept the cabin calm, having instructed the crew to continue service normally, without revealing our critical situation. Most passengers continued sleeping, oblivious to the drama unfolding meters away. Hey, if this story is gripping you as much as it gripped me to live through it, leave me a comment telling me what part of the world you're listening from. I'd love to know where this story reached. And if you dig these kinds of real aviation stories, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next episodes. Then, finally, after 3 hours and 8 minutes flying with minimal instrumentation, I saw something on the distant horizon that made my heart race. Lights, small points of yellowish light in the darkness. Land. It had to be land. Michael, are you seeing this? Affirmative. Must be the Azores. We made it. But our journey still wasn't over. We had to land that aircraft at night without instrument approach systems, without radio communication, without airport weather information. It would be a pure visual landing, something not normally done with an aircraft of this size in nighttime conditions. As we approached, the lights became more defined. I managed to identify what appeared to be the main city, and more importantly, the lights of an airport runway. Michael tried one last time to establish radio communication, transmitting blind on all emergency frequencies. Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. Aircraft with 401 souls on board. Total instrument failure. Approaching Lajes for emergency landing. Nothing. Absolute silence. We were on our own. I began the descent, keeping it smooth so as not to alarm the passengers. Sarah had prepared the cabin crew for a potentially abnormal landing, but still maintaining calm among passengers. Most were now waking with the descent, noticing it from the pressure in their ears. Henry stayed with us until the end, offering words of encouragement. Captain, in all my years designing this aircraft, I imagined many emergencies. But what you're doing here, flying this machine with practically nothing but instinct and courage, is beyond any scenario we simulated. You're going to make it. And speaking of incredible aviation stories, if you want to know 100 more cases that changed the history of flying forever, check out the QR code appearing on screen. There you'll find the ebook, Black Box 100 Air Accidents That Changed Aviation Forever, with a special offer you won't want to miss. The Lajes runway was now clear ahead of me. It appeared long enough for our aircraft. Aligning the approach was an immense challenge without ILS or any instrument approach aid. I used only my vision and experience, constantly adjusting to maintain alignment with the runway lights. Speed was an estimate based on the aircraft's feel, the sound of the wind, the response to controls. Altitude was calculated visually by distance to the lights. It was like returning to the primitive era of aviation, but with a 250-ton machine carrying 401 lives, 500 feet. The runway growing rapidly ahead of me, 300 feet. I could now see emergency vehicles being mobilized at the airport. Someone down there had perceived our unannounced approach. 200 feet. Prepare for touchdown, I warned Michael. 100 feet. I gradually reduced power. 50 feet. I gently raised the aircraft's nose, configuring for the flare. 30 feet. 20. 10. And then, with a prolonged screech of tires and the scream of the reversers, we touched the Lajes runway. It wasn't my smoothest landing, but it was, without doubt, the most important of my life. I decelerated the aircraft using only thrust reversal and brakes, without precise speed reference, just feeling when it was safe to reduce braking. We stopped completely about 2/3 down the runway. For a moment, the cockpit was in absolute silence. Then Michael started to cry. Henry placed a hand on my shoulder, wordless. I just breathed, feeling every muscle in my body shake with the release of accumulated adrenaline. We'd done it. All 401 passengers were safe on the ground. The following seconds were a blur. Emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft. Airport police came up, confused about who we were and where we came from since we hadn't established prior communication. Sarah opened the doors, and I began to hear the passengers' applause. They didn't know exactly what had happened, but they felt something extraordinary had occurred. Azores authorities came up to the cockpit, and slowly, with Henry's help, we explained the whole situation. Incredulous, the airport's chief controller shook his head. "You flew across the ocean without instruments? And managed to find us? That's Impossible. But it wasn't impossible. It was the result of training, experience, teamwork, and maybe a bit of luck. The subsequent investigation revealed we'd suffered an extremely rare failure in the avionics power distribution system, caused by a microscopic manufacturing defect in an electronic component that had gone unnoticed in all inspections. The statistical probability of that specific failure was estimated at less than 1 in 10 million flights. But it had happened to us that night over the Atlantic. We spent 2 days in the Azores, while a replacement aircraft was sent to transport passengers to their final destination. During that time, several of them came to thank me personally, not fully understanding how close we'd been to disaster. Henry, the retired engineer, became a personal friend. He told me he'd returned to Boeing to recommend changes in redundancy systems, inspired by what he'd witnessed that night. I returned to flying 3 months later, after extensive debriefings with aviation authorities and mandatory psychological evaluation. To this day, when I fly over the Atlantic at night, I look at that black immensity and remember those 60 seconds. 60 seconds where everything I was as a pilot, everything I'd learned, everything I'd trained for, was tested in a way I never imagined possible. 60 seconds where the lives of 401 people depended on decisions made with minimal instruments and maximum instinct. Many ask me how I managed to stay calm in that moment. The truth? I don't know if I did. Inside, I was terrified. But I learned over the years that fear is natural, panic is a choice, and that night I chose to trust my training, my team, and the extraordinary machine I was piloting. I chose to believe that years of preparation wouldn't fail me at the most critical moment. And they didn't. Today, when I hear stories of aviation accidents, I think about how many pilots face impossible dilemmas every day. Situations where there's no right answer in the manuals, where simulator training didn't prepare, where every second counts and there's no time for consultations or doubts. And I wonder how many of those stories end well because of decisions made in split seconds, based on instinct developed through years of experience. That flight changed my perspective on aviation. I realized that, however advanced the technology, however sophisticated the systems, in the end we still depend on the human element, on a pilot's ability to make decisions under extreme pressure, to trust their senses when all instruments fail, to stay calm when chaos reigns, and to never ever give up while there's a chance, however small. I know I was lucky that night. Lucky to have an exceptional co-pilot. Lucky to have Henry on board. Lucky that the storms were exactly where I needed them. Lucky that the attitude instrument battery restarted. Lucky to manage to identify the Larget's lights in the darkness. But I also know we made our own luck through preparation, training, and refusal to accept defeat. I keep in touch with several passengers from that flight to this day. Many of them write me on the anniversaries of the incident, thanking me for having another year of life. Some tell me they completely changed their lives after that night, realizing how fragile and precious existence is. Others simply want to know that I'm still flying, that we didn't let that experience drive us away from the skies. And I always reply, I'm still flying because that's what pilots do. We face the impossible and transform it into possible. The airline where I work created a new training program based on that incident. Now all pilots go through simulations of total instrument failures, something that was previously considered so improbable it didn't receive special attention. They learn to fly using only minimal references, to trust their senses, to make decisions with limited information. I teach some of those training sessions, and I always emphasize, you can train 1,000 scenarios, but when you face a real one, it'll be different. Prepare yourself not just technically, but mentally and emotionally for the impossible. Years later, I still receive messages from young pilots asking for career advice about how to develop instinct, about how to prepare for emergencies. I always reply, fly as much as you can. Absorb every experience, every flight, every different weather condition. Don't rely only on automation. Feel the aircraft. Know its sounds, its behaviors, its peculiarities, and mainly, never stop learning. Because it was exactly that accumulated knowledge, that lived experience, that saved us that night over the ocean. There were also negative consequences. I developed a mild degree of anxiety on nighttime flights over ocean, especially when all systems are working perfectly. I keep waiting for that electronic snap, those flickering screens. My wife notices when I come back tense from those flights, and yes, I sought professional help to deal with that. It's no shame to admit that even experienced pilots can develop trauma after critical incidents. It's part of the human journey. What's important is to recognize it and seek support. Today, 7 years after that flight, I look back and see that experience as the defining moment of my career. Not because I want glory or recognition, but because it taught me fundamental truths about aviation, about leadership under pressure, about trust in a team, and about the indomitable human spirit when confronted with impossible situations. It taught me that the true test of a pilot isn't how many flight hours they have in the logbook or how many certifications they have on the wall. It's what they do in those critical moments where everything went wrong and there's no procedure manual. Those initial 60 seconds when everything went dark and I had only my senses and instinct to keep 401 people in the air were the longest and most important 60 seconds of my life. They were 60 seconds where I learned that sometimes all the technology in the world doesn't replace experience, intuition, and the human determination to protect the lives under your responsibility. 60 seconds that transformed theory into practice, training into real action, and fear into absolute focus. Modern aviation is incredibly safe. Statistically, it's the safest form of transportation that exists. But that doesn't happen by chance. It happens because generations of pilots, engineers, controllers, and aviation professionals learned from each incident, each emergency, each critical moment. My story now forms part of that collective body of knowledge, helping to make flight even safer for the next generations. Sometimes on quiet nights, I close my eyes and place myself back in that cockpit. I feel the texture of the yoke under my hand. I hear the tone of the engines keeping that Boeing suspended in the darkness. I see Michael at my side, confident and focused despite the terror we both felt. I feel the weight of responsibility for all those lives. And I silently thank for having had the preparation, the team, and yes, the luck necessary to bring everyone safely home. When they ask me what went through my head in those first critical 60 seconds, I answer honestly, I thought about all the people behind that cockpit door. I thought about my wife and children waiting for me at home. I thought about all the pilots who came before me and faced their own impossible moments, and I decided I wouldn't be the captain who gave up when everything seemed lost. I'd be the captain who fought until the last second, using every ounce of knowledge and experience to save that aircraft. That's my story. The story of 60 seconds that changed everything. 60 seconds where every decision counted. 60 seconds that transformed into 4 hours of pure determination, and 4 hours that became a life lesson about never underestimating the power of preparation, teamwork, and refusing to accept defeat when lives are at stake. If you made it this far listening to my account, I hope you take away not just a dramatic story, but a reflection on professional excellence, on the importance of preparing for the improbable, and on the fact that, sometimes, the most important moments of our lives come when we least expect them and test us in ways we never imagined. And when those moments arrive, all we can do is trust our preparation and give our best. Aviation gave me everything. A rewarding career, unforgettable experiences, lasting friendships, and life purpose. And that night over the ocean, I had the opportunity to give back using everything aviation taught me to protect the lives of 401 people who trusted me. It was my honor, my privilege, and my maximum responsibility as captain, and if I had to do it all again, I wouldn't change a single decision. So next time you board a flight, look at that cockpit door and remember, inside there are professionals trained for the impossible, prepared to transform 60 seconds of chaos into survival stories, and committed above all to a simple but profound mission. Bring you and everyone on board safely home no matter what happens. That's the promise we make every time we take the controls. And it's a promise we take deadly seriously. Because in the end, aviation isn't just about flying. It's about lives, trust, responsibility, and the unwavering commitment to do the right thing, even when everything goes wrong. Always. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the invisible challenges we face every day in the skies, leave your comment telling me where you're watching us from right now. I'd really love to know where in the world this story reached. And if you appreciate true accounts from aviation, leave your like and subscribe to the Black Box channel. We have hundreds of real stories from the skies waiting to be told, each with its own lessons about courage, professionalism, and the extraordinary human spirit.